The rain fell quiet on a forgotten storage yard, where a weary veteran named Jake stood with his dog, Buddy. $300 had bought him nothing but rust and shadows, or so he thought. But what could truly be hidden behind dust-covered boxes and broken chairs? Could a single choice open the door to redemption, or bury him deeper in regret? Stay tuned, because what Jake uncovered inside this abandoned unit will test not only his courage, but the very meaning of loyalty and love. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope and second chances. The evening sky above the small industrial town was muted gray, the kind of gray that pressed down like a heavy hand. A thin drizzle clung to the cracked sidewalks, and the wind carried the faint smell of iron, oil, and damp earth. Streetlights flickered on one by one, throwing tired halos over potholes and shuttered storefronts. Inside a decaying apartment complex on the edge of town lived Jake Wilson, a man who wore his 45 years like a soldier wears a scar, quietly, with no chance of disguise. Jake stood at the window, staring at the rain trickling down the glass, his hands resting on the frame. His shoulders were broad but slightly stooped, as if the weight of the years had bent him forward. A thick jawline covered in uneven stubble hinted at the man he once was, proud, disciplined, ready for the fight. But his hazel eyes, rimmed with exhaustion and shadowed by memories, told a different story. One of sleepless nights, debts unpaid, and a future that seemed to shrink each day. The apartment smelled faintly of old smoke and metal shavings that clung to his jacket from long hours at the mechanical shop. The place was small, with peeling wallpaper, a sagging couch that had seen better decades, and a crooked lamp standing in the corner like a soldier who had forgotten his post. To most, it was nothing but ruin. To Jake, it was both refuge and prison. By the door, lying patiently on a thin rug, was Buddy, his 5-year-old German shepherd. Buddy was a large dog, his coat a mix of sable black and tan, thick enough to hold warmth in the bitter winters. His amber eyes followed Jake with quiet intensity, a gaze that seemed to read his master's mind more accurately than any human could. His ears perked at the smallest shift in Jake's breath. His body carried the strength of youth, but his gaze carried the calm loyalty of an old friend. To Jake, Buddy was not just a dog. He was the only heartbeat that stayed steady in a world where everything else faltered. Jake moved to the table, where an envelope with red ink lettering lay unopened. The words "Final Notice" were bold, merciless, and sharp. His calloused hands hovered over it, but refused to break the seal. He had seen enough warnings in life, warnings that came in, shouted commands on battlefields, in the silence of his ex-wife's eyes, when she decided she had carried enough. And now, in letters that threatened to strip away what little he had left. He thought of his son, Daniel. 15 now, tall for his age, with the same sharp cheekbones Jake once carried proudly. But the boy didn't live here. He lived with Sarah, Jake's ex-wife. Sarah Miller, a woman of quiet endurance, stood 5'7", slim but wiry, with chestnut brown hair that fell in tired waves. She had once been radiant with laughter, but years of disappointment had carved fine lines across her pale skin. She wasn't cruel, just weary. She wanted stability for her son, something Jake could never give. And so, Daniel stayed with her, while Jake was reduced to the occasional phone call filled with awkward silences and stilted advice that rarely landed. The distance gnawed at Jake more than any unpaid bill or aching joint. War had taken much from him, but losing the closeness of his son was the deepest wound. Some nights, he lay awake listening to Buddy's steady breathing, wondering if Daniel hated him, or worse, if Daniel had simply learned to live without needing him. Jake sat heavily on the couch, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. He rubbed his temples, the lines on his forehead deepening with the pressure of memories. He saw flashes of Afghanistan, sandstorms that blinded, nights pierced by distant gunfire, the sudden loss of brothers in arms whose names were now carved into plaques. There was Corporal Davis, with his crooked grin and reckless courage, gone in an instant when the convoy hit an IED. There was Sergeant Lopez, who carried a photograph of his daughters into every mission, a photograph that had to be pulled from the wreckage of a Humvee. Those ghosts never left Jake. They rode home with him, sat at the foot of his bed, whispered in his dreams. He clenched his fists. Why them and not me? It was a question he never voiced aloud, but it carved him from the inside like rust eating metal. Buddy shifted on the rug, sensing the shift in Jake's mood. The dog patted over, resting his heavy head on Jake's knee. The warmth of Buddy's fur pressed against him like a reminder. Here, now, alive. Jake managed a small smile, stroking Buddy's ears. "You're the only one who hasn't given up on me, huh?" he whispered. Buddy's tail thumped softly, steady as a heartbeat. The mechanical shop where Jake worked was nothing special. A cavern of noise, the stench of grease, and endless repetition. He loaded crates, tightened bolts, hauled steel under the orders of foremen who barely remembered his name. His body ached each evening, but his paycheck barely stretched to cover rent and food. Men like him were invisible here until something needed lifting, fixing, or cleaning. Then suddenly, "Wilson!" echoed through the noise, and he obeyed. His co-workers knew little of him. Jake wasn't unfriendly, but he had mastered the art of silence. They saw a man tall and broad-shouldered, with hands thick from labor and scars he never explained. They didn't see the soldier inside, the man who once commanded respect, who once carried lives in his hands. They saw only a tired laborer with a haunted gaze and a loyal dog waiting outside the gate at quitting time. Occasionally, someone tried to draw him out. There was Rick, a lanky 30-year-old with a mop of blonde hair and an easy grin, who liked to joke about women and lottery tickets. "You ever try your luck, Wilson?" he asked once, shoving a scratch off under Jake's nose. Jake only shook his head, muttering, "Luck doesn't visit me." The others laughed, but Rick frowned as if glimpsing the hollow truth behind the words. That night, after another long shift, Jake walked the rain-slick streets with Buddy at his side. He thought of Sarah again, of Daniel, of the way Sarah's voice tightened whenever Jake said he wanted to see his son more often. "He needs stability, Jake," she had told him once, her eyes dark with both pity and accusation. "He can't live in that run-down apartment, surrounded by your ghosts." Jake had no answer then, and he had none now. He reached the apartment and collapsed onto the couch. Buddy curled beside him, head resting on Jake's thigh. The television flickered in the corner, muted news anchors mouthing stories about scandals and storms. Jake stared without seeing, his mind trapped in loops of memory and longing. A clap of thunder shook the window, pulling him back to the present. He looked around his small apartment, at the crooked lamp, the unopened envelope, the shadows dancing in the rainlight. He felt the crushing sameness of it all, every day bleeding into the next. He exhaled, slow and shaky. Yet beneath that exhaustion, a small ember of hunger remained. Not for wealth, not for luxury, just for something that would prove his life wasn't only about debts and disappointments. A sign that he hadn't been left behind completely. As he stroked Buddy's fur, that ember flickered brighter, though he didn't yet know why. Buddy licked his hand, and Jake chuckled softly, the sound rusty but real. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, though he had no idea what tomorrow held. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for a moment allowed himself to imagine a different life. A life where his son looked at him with pride, where Sarah spoke without pity, where the world finally gave him a second chance. The rain continued outside, steady, relentless, like time itself. Buddy kept his watch, amber eyes glowing in the dim room, guarding the fragile ember inside Jake that refused to die. Jake Wilson sat at the chipped kitchen table the next morning, staring at a cold mug of coffee. The rain had lifted, leaving the world washed but still heavy with the weight of damp concrete and rust. Sunlight filtered through blinds that had lost half their slats, casting uneven stripes across the cluttered counter. Buddy, ever alert, rested near the back door, his ears twitching at every passing truck outside. Jake's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the cracked screen. The caller ID read simply, Sarah. His heart tightened. He hadn't spoken to his ex-wife in weeks, not since their last tense conversation about Daniel. For a moment, he considered letting it ring out, but then he pressed the green button. "Jake," Sarah's voice came, low but firm, carrying the exhaustion of years. Sarah Miller had always been a striking woman, though time and worry had left their marks. At 40, she was still slender, her frame wiry and taut like a bowstring, her chestnut hair often tied back in a simple knot. She had pale skin that bruised easily in the sun and hazel eyes that once brimmed with warmth but now carried a constant edge of caution. Sarah had learned long ago that life punished softness. "Morning," Jake replied, rubbing his forehead. "You didn't call Daniel for his birthday?" she said flatly. The words struck like a hammer. Guilt washed over him. He had known. But between double shifts at the shop and unopened bills on the counter, he had pushed the date aside. He swallowed hard. I thought about him. Just didn't." His voice cracked. Sarah exhaled, the sound brittle. "Thinking isn't enough, Jake? He's 15. He notices. He pretends he doesn't care, but he does." Buddy stood, padded closer, and pressed his head against Jake's thigh, as if sensing the sting of the words. Jake stroked the fur absently, searching for air. "How's he doing?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Sarah hesitated. "He's quiet. Keeps to himself. Doesn't bring friends over. Spends too much time in that basement with his music. He says he's fine, but I know when he's lying. He's got your stubbornness." Jake almost smiled at that, but it died quickly. He pictured Daniel, tall, lean, hair the color of dark sand, his mother's eyes but his father's jawline. A boy trying to be a man too fast, while silently wondering why his father had slipped to the sidelines. "Let me see him this weekend," Jake said suddenly. There was silence on the other end, long enough that Jake feared she'd already hung up. Finally, Sarah replied, "Jake, he needs stability. And your place." Her words trailed off, but Jake knew the meaning. His shabby apartment, the flickering lights, the peeling wallpaper. Not the kind of environment Sarah wanted for her son. "I'll fix it," Jake muttered. "I just need time." "Time is what Daniel doesn't have, Jake," Sarah snapped. "He's growing up, right now. You can't just keep waiting until your life looks better. You either show up or you don't." The call ended abruptly. Jake sat frozen, the silence of the kitchen pressing in. Buddy gave a small whine and licked his hand, pulling him back from the spiral. Later that afternoon, at the mechanical shop, Jake threw himself into work with a fury. He hauled steel beams until his arms burned, tightened bolts until his hands shook. Sweat plastered his shirt to his back, but it didn't quiet the storm inside him. Around him, the chatter of co-workers swirled. One of them, Tom Hargrove, slapped Jake on the shoulder as he passed. Tom was in his early 50s, with broad shoulders gone slightly soft and a thick mustache flecked with gray. His laugh was booming, though his eyes carried a tired kindness. Tom had worked at the shop for decades, the kind of man who knew everyone's name and story. He was respected because he had once lost everything in a house fire 20 years earlier, yet rebuilt his life piece by piece. That tragedy had stripped away his arrogance, leaving him patient and fatherly. "You look like you're carrying the whole damn shop on your back," Tom said, setting down a crate. Jake forced a small grin. "Maybe I am." Tom studied him, scratching at his mustache. "You've got that look again. The one that says you're fighting ghosts instead of steel." Jake shrugged, unwilling to explain, but Tom had a way of pressing gently. "You know, Wilson, you don't win fights in silence. Sometimes you've got to let someone else throw a punch for you." The words lingered even after the shift ended. Jake walked home under the dimming sky, Buddy leaping happily as he reached the apartment door. He sat on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling through old photos of Daniel, a boy in a Little League uniform, missing teeth in his smile. Another shot with Buddy as a puppy, both sprawled on the living room floor. His chest ached. He typed a message. "Happy birthday, son. I'm proud of you. Let's meet soon." Then he erased it, rewrote, erased again. Finally, he sent just, "Happy birthday. I love you." The reply came an hour later. "Thanks, Dad." Nothing more. But Jake stared at the words until his vision blurred. Buddy climbed beside him, resting against his shoulder. The next day, Jake stopped at a diner after work. The place was small, with cracked leather booths and the smell of fried onions that clung to everything. The waitress, Marlene, had served there for 20 years. She was a plump woman in her late 40s, with frizzy blonde hair and a permanent smile that covered a sharp wit. She set a plate of meatloaf in front of Jake and leaned on the counter. "You look worse than yesterday, hun," she said. "Just tired," Jake muttered. "You're always tired." "You ever think about what comes after tired?" Marlene asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake gave a humorless chuckle. "Does it get better?" Marlene tilted her. "It depends. Sometimes life hands you a miracle. Sometimes it just hands you another bill, but you don't get either if you quit showing up. She winked, then moved on to another customer. Jake chewed slowly, her words echoing in his mind. Maybe there was something still waiting for him, some door left unopened. That night, as he lay awake again, Buddy curled at his feet. Jake replayed Sarah's voice, Tom's advice, Marlene's bluntness. He thought of Daniel, of the distance between them, of the boy's single-word reply. The ache grew sharper, but beneath it flickered determination. "I'll find a way," Jake whispered to the dark. "For him. For us," Buddy's ears twitched, and his tail thumped once, as if sealing the promise. The week dragged on with the weight of routine. Jake Wilson rose each dawn to the hum of factory machines in his head, carried his tired body to the mechanical shop, and returned home with grease-stained hands and shoulders that sagged a little more each day. Buddy shadowed him faithfully, padding along the cracked sidewalks, tail swishing in rhythm, eyes always bright despite the dull monotony of his master's life. On a Wednesday afternoon, the shop buzzed louder than usual. The men had gathered near the loading bay, voices carrying with the swagger of men who felt they'd stumbled onto luck. Jake approached slowly, towel slung over his shoulder, wiping the sweat from his neck. "Got myself a score," bragged Eddie Harper, a wiry man in his mid-30s with a shaved head and a thin goatee that sharpened his already fox-like features. Eddie was the kind of man who always seemed restless, tapping his foot, cracking jokes too loud. Yet, underneath his bravado, there was a streak of desperation. Years earlier, he had blown his savings gambling in Reno, a mistake that left him cynical, but forever chasing the next win. "What kind of score?" asked another worker, Calvin Brooks, a burly man in his 40s with thick arms, cropped black hair, and a square jaw. Calvin was known for his no-nonsense demeanor and booming laugh, though life had taught him caution after losing his brother to an accident at the steel mill. Eddie grinned, pulling out his phone to show blurry photos. "Storage auction. Picked up a unit for $250, full of old tools, antique stuff. Already sold half of it for triple." Calvin whistled. "That's luck right there." "Not luck," Eddie corrected smugly. "Instinct. You look at the pile, smell the opportunity. People just abandon these units, walk away, forget to pay. The facility sells it off. Sometimes you get garbage, sure, but sometimes—" He let the sentence hang, eyes gleaming. Jake listened quietly, leaning against a crate. He knew Eddie liked to exaggerate, but the way Calvin leaned in told him this wasn't a tall tale. Eddie swiped to another photo, a set of old wrenches, rusted but valuable to collectors. Jake's gaze lingered longer than he expected. Later, as Jake hauled boxes onto a dolly, Calvin caught his eye. "You ever think about it, Wilson? Buying one of those units might be worth a shot." Jake shook his head. "I don't gamble." Calvin shrugged. "Maybe not. But sometimes the gamble finds you anyway." That night, Jake sat at his kitchen table. Buddy stretched out nearby, paws twitching in dreams. The envelope of bills lay untouched, mocking him. He thought of Sarah's sharp voice on the phone, of Daniel's short reply, "Thanks, Dad." His chest tightened. He needed to show his son he was still capable of something more than surviving. But how? His paycheck barely covered necessities. Saving was a fantasy. The thought of those abandoned storage units, dusty secrets waiting to be cracked open, gnawed at him. Could he really risk what little he had left? Buddy stirred, lifting his head, amber eyes catching Jake's. The dog padded over, rested his chin on Jake's knee, and wagged his tail once. Jake chuckled bitterly. "You think I should, huh? Spend what's left on someone else's forgotten junk?" Buddy only thumped his tail harder, as if urging him on. The following evening, Jake stopped by the diner again. Marlene, the waitress with her frizzy blonde hair and sharp eyes, slid a plate of meatloaf in front of him. "You're quieter than usual, hun," she said, folding her arms. Jake stirred the mashed potatoes with his fork. "Ever hear of those storage auctions? Guys bidding on units people abandoned." Marlene snorted. "Oh, sure. My cousin tried once. Spent $300, came home with nothing but mothballs and a broken treadmill. Swore he'd never do it again." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "But then again, I heard of a man in town who found old baseball cards worth thousands. Sold them to some collector out of Chicago. Paid off his mortgage. So, I guess it's like lightning. Sometimes it strikes." Jake smiled faintly. And sometimes it burns you. Everything does, Marlene replied, straightening up. Question is, what risk feels worth it to you? Her words followed him all the way home. That night, Jake lay awake staring at the ceiling, Buddy curled at his feet. The factory, the bills, the distant voice of his son, all swirled together with Eddie's smug grin and Marlene's blunt wisdom. For the first time in years, Jake felt something stirring. Not hope exactly, but the whisper of possibility. 2 days later, as Jake left the shop, he spotted a flyer tacked to a telephone pole near the bus stop. The paper was damp from rain, edges curled, but the bold letters were clear. Storage auction, Saturday 9 a.m., Westview facility. Jake stared at it, heart pounding. He reached out, tore the flyer down, and folded it into his jacket pocket. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool. Jake pulled on his worn denim jacket, laced up his boots, and whistled for Buddy. The dog bounded over, tail wagging, sensing the shift in his master's mood. Jake counted out the cash from his envelope, $350, all he had left after paying for groceries and gas. It was a reckless sum for a man in his position, but he stuffed it into his wallet, tucked it deep, and stepped outside. As he locked the door, he caught his reflection in the cracked glass. A tall, broad-shouldered man, jaw rough with stubble, eyes shadowed, but not dead. For the first time in a long while, he didn't look entirely broken. Buddy barked once, sharp and eager, as if to say, "Let's go." Jake nodded, tightening his grip on the leash. "All right, boy. Let's see if luck remembers me." The Westview storage facility sat at the far edge of town, beyond the gas stations and sagging motels. A sprawling row of corrugated metal doors lined up like weary soldiers who had seen better days. The Saturday morning air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of rust and damp concrete. Trucks and sedans filled the gravel lot, their owners spilling out in small groups, laughter and sharp voices echoing off the steel walls. Jake Wilson parked his dented Ford at the edge, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, hands gripping the wheel. Buddy shifted restlessly in the passenger seat, ears perked, sensing the tension rolling off his master. Jake exhaled, adjusted his worn jacket, and stepped out. Buddy leapt down, stretching before falling into step beside him, tail wagging with anticipation. The crowd gathered near the office, seasoned bidders with weathered faces, some sipping coffee from paper cups, others trading stories of past finds. Jake felt out of place, his broad frame and stiff posture setting him apart from their casual swagger. His boots crunched on gravel as he followed them, Buddy close at his side. A man in a bright blazer, the auctioneer, clapped his hands. Frank Mallory, in his mid-50s, had a barrel chest and a round face framed by graying sideburns. His suit was cheap but loud, the color of mustard, and his booming voice carried the rhythm of a preacher. Frank had been in the trade for decades, known for his quick wit and quicker tongue. Behind the cheerful grin, though, was a man hardened by divorce and debts of his own, someone who masked desperation with showmanship. "All right, folks," Frank bellowed. "We've got 15 units today. Remember the rules. No touching, no stepping inside, just a quick look. What you see is what you get." The first door screeched upward, revealing stacks of moldy cardboard boxes and a broken refrigerator leaning against the wall. The crowd groaned, some chuckling as Frank's voice cut through. "Starting at 50. Do I hear 50? A few hands rose, but the bidding ended quickly, and the winner muttered something about scrap metal. Jake hung back, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He tried to study the others, men and women, who seemed to smell fortune in mildew and dust. There was Linda Parsons, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, lean with cropped black hair streaked with silver. She wore a leather jacket and heavy boots, her expression always calculating. A former accountant who had lost her career in the financial crash a decade earlier, Linda had turned to storage auctions with the precision of a chess player. She took notes in a battered journal, scanning each unit with hawk-like intensity. Beside her stood Ray Delgado, a hulking man in his late 30s with tattooed forearms and a shaved head. His thick beard gave him a rough edge, though his dark eyes carried a surprising gentleness. Ray had once been a mechanic before his shop failed. Now he hunted auctions, hoping for a find that might let him start again. He towered over the crowd, but kept mostly silent, bidding only when certain. Unit after unit opened, Dusty mattresses, chipped dishes, boxes of magazines warped with damp. The smell of mold clung to Jake's nostrils, sour and choking. His nerves frayed with each reveal, his hope thinning. Buddy, however, stayed alert, sniffing the air each time the doors rattled upward, as if searching for something invisible to human eyes. By the 10th unit, Jake's shoulders slumped. He wondered if he'd made a mistake, throwing away what little he had. Sarah's voice echoed in his head. Daniel needs stability. What stability could he offer if he gambled away their last chance at groceries? The crowd shifted as another worker stepped forward, a ring of keys jangling in his hand. The man was thin, pale-skinned, with a permanent stoop from years of lifting heavy doors. His name tag read, Carl, a custodian at the facility. Carl had hollow cheeks, thinning blonde hair, and an absent expression, like someone who had long ago resigned himself to monotony. Without a word, he jammed the key into the lock of the next unit and yanked the door upward. The hinges groaned in protest, shrieking like a wounded animal. Rust flaked onto the gravel as the door rattled higher, revealing a dim interior. Shadows swallowed most of it, but what was visible looked unremarkable. A broken bicycle leaned at an awkward angle against a cracked cabinet. An armchair slouched in the corner, its upholstery sagging, and a few cardboard boxes collapsed under dampness. The crowd murmured with impatience. Waste of time, someone muttered. Others drifted back, already dismissing the lot. Jake lingered at the edge, his chest heavy with defeat. He was ready to step away when Buddy suddenly tugged on the leash. The German shepherd whined, then barked sharply, tail stiff, ears pointed at the shadowed corner of the unit. Jake blinked, surprised. Buddy rarely barked without reason. Frank clapped his hands, voice rolling. All right, folks, opening bid, 100. Do I hear 100? Silence. Linda scribbled something in her journal, shook her head. Ray crossed his arms, unmoved. Eddie, standing at the back with his sly grin, muttered, Looks like trash to me. Frank's smile faltered slightly. 50 then. $50 to start. Still no hands. The crowd shuffled, uninterested. Jake felt his palms dampen. Buddy barked again, pulling at the leash, eyes fixed on the shadows. Jake's heart raced. What if? The whisper of possibility returned, insistent. He raised his hand slowly. 50 from the gentleman in the back, Frank cried, relief brightening his tone. Do I hear 60? 60? No one moved. The silence stretched, broken only by Buddy's panting. Sold! Frank's gavel cracked against his palm. To the man with the dog. Congratulations! The crowd dispersed, already eager for the next unit, leaving Jake rooted to the spot, staring at the dim, rust-stained doorway that now belonged to him. Buddy wagged his tail furiously, pressing against his leg as though proud. Jake swallowed, a strange mix of dread and anticipation filling him. For better or worse, he had just bought himself a piece of someone else's forgotten past. The rusty door rattled as Jake tugged it higher, the hinges screaming like they hadn't been moved in years. Dust spilled into the light, forming lazy spirals that drifted toward the gravel lot. The crowd of bidders had already moved on to the next unit, leaving Jake standing alone with Buddy at his side. He hesitated at the threshold, eyes adjusting to the dim space. The smell struck first, mildew, rot, the damp musk of neglect. Buddy sneezed, then whined softly, nose twitching as he sniffed the stale air. Jake stepped inside, boots crunching against scattered plaster and grit. The sight before him pulled the wind from his chest. Against the far wall leaned a child's bicycle, its paint chipped, one handlebar missing, both tires flat. Beside it slouched a sagging armchair, its once bright fabric torn into strips, yellowed stuffing spilling out like innards. Piles of cardboard boxes sat collapsed and damp, their lids bowed under years of weight. A stack of clothes slumped in one corner, their colors bled into a uniform brown by mold. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, jaw tightening. His palms still sweated from the adrenaline of bidding, but now only cold disappointment remained. $300, he muttered under his breath, voice thick. For trash. Buddy padded forward, sniffing at the boxes, his nails clicking on the concrete. He glanced back at Jake, ears perked, tail wagging hesitantly, as if asking for patience. Jake crouched, pulled the lid off one box, and found nothing but brittle shirts, collars eaten through by moths. Another box held old newspapers, pages fused together by moisture, headlines ghostly and unreadable. He flung the lid aside, the sound sharp in the empty unit. From outside, footsteps approached. It was Carl, the gaunt custodian who had opened the doors earlier. He leaned on the doorway, arms folded loosely. His thinning blonde hair clung to his damp forehead, his skin pale under the weak sunlight. Carl's voice was flat, worn thin by repetition. Most of them are like this. People think they're buying gold mines, but mostly it's just garbage folks didn't care enough to haul away. Jake looked over his shoulder, frowning. You see a lot of these? Carl shrugged, shifting his weight. Every week, I've cleaned out more units than I can count. Family heirlooms, broken furniture, old toys, stuff that meant something once, but not enough to pay rent on. Sad, really. His eyes flicked to Buddy, softening for a moment. At least you got company. Dog like that won't let you down. Jake nodded, but didn't answer. Carl lingered a second longer, then shuffled off toward the noise of the next auction. Alone again, Jake slumped against the cracked cabinet, his breath shallow. He thought of Sarah, her voice sharp with disappointment. He thought of Daniel, his short message. Thanks, Dad. He pictured handing over an empty wallet, explaining he'd wasted what little remained on. Rust and mildew. The weight pressed harder than the musty air. Let's go, Buddy, he whispered, pushing himself upright. But Buddy didn't move. The dog stood rigid near the back corner, nose pressed to the floor, claws scraping against the dust. He pawed insistently, tail stiff, eyes focused. Jake frowned. What is it, boy? He stepped closer, crouched beside Buddy, and brushed his hand across the dusty floor. The concrete felt uneven. He pressed again, felt a faint ridge, as if something sat just beneath. Buddy barked once, sharp and sure, then scratched harder, dust flying into the air. Jake's pulse quickened. He pulled the boxes aside, ignoring the mildew that clung to his fingers, and leaned closer to the wall. Beneath the grime, a faint outline appeared. Wooden boards stacked in a way that didn't match the rest of the unit. He tapped them, and the hollow sound echoed back. His heart thudded in his chest. For a moment, hope flared, fragile but bright. Maybe Buddy had found something more than trash. Maybe this gamble wasn't wasted after all. Still kneeling, Jake ran a hand through Buddy's thick fur, whispering, "Good boy. You always know, don't you?" Buddy wagged his tail, panting softly, eyes glowing in the dimness. Jake exhaled, sat back on his heels, and stared at the corner. It might be nothing, a trick of old construction, a pile of rotting wood. But it could also be something else, something hidden, something waiting. For the first time since he'd lifted the rusted door, Jake felt the ember of possibility spark again. Jake Wilson knelt in the dim light of the storage unit, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cool morning air. His fingertips traced the uneven boards Buddy had uncovered, the hollow echo beneath his knuckles tugging at something deep inside him, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, his gamble hadn't been wasted. Buddy stood poised beside him, tail wagging slowly, as if he too understood that something extraordinary lay beneath. Jake braced his hands against the floor and shoved one of the warped boxes aside. It toppled with a thud, spilling damp rags across the concrete. The smell of mold thickened, but Jake ignored it, focused on the outline of the planks. He grabbed a piece of rusted metal from the broken bicycle and wedged it under the edge of a board. With a grunt, he pried upward. The nail shrieked in protest before snapping free, the wood splintering with age. Dust swirled as the first board gave way. Beneath it was not empty concrete, but the edge of a wooden crate. Jake's breath caught. He clawed at the boards, Buddy barking once, the sound sharp in the silence. Piece by piece, he lifted away the covering until the full crate emerged, old and worn, the lid secured with nails dulled by decades. His pulse hammered as he crouched, running his hand over the splintered surface. Carved faintly into the wood was a set of initials, nearly faded, R.H. He didn't recognize the name, but the weight of secrecy pressed from the box. Whoever had hidden it had wanted it buried, shielded from prying eyes. Jake pressed the metal shard under the lid, prying until one side cracked open. The sound of nails snapping echoed like gunfire in his ears. When the lid came loose, Jake pulled it aside and froze. Inside, neatly arranged in cloth pouches, were silver coins, their edges glinting faintly through layers of tarnish. He reached in with trembling hands, lifted one pouch, and let the coins spill into his palm. Cold, heavy, real. He blinked hard, half expecting them to dissolve into dust. But they remained, solid and undeniable, proof that his risk had unearthed something far beyond expectation. "Jesus!" he whispered, voice cracking. Buddy barked again, tail thumping against the crate, as if urging him to believe it. Jake dug deeper. Beneath the coins were rolled canvases wrapped in yellowed fabric. He lifted one carefully, unrolling just enough to see bold brushstrokes of deep blues and reds, the colors still vivid despite their age. A painting, signed faintly in the corner by a name he couldn't place. His hands shook as he re-rolled it, the thought of value pressing heavy against his chest. In another section of the crate, he found books bound in cracked leather, their spines embossed with fading gold letters. He opened one carefully, the pages brittle, carrying the faint smell of old ink and time. Some bore handwritten notes in the margins, an elegant script that hinted at education and wealth. At the bottom lay bundles of envelopes tied with fraying twine. Jake picked one up, the paper yellowed, the ink faded but legible. The letters inside were written in looping cursive, dated nearly a century earlier. They spoke of estates, quarrels between siblings, debts, and inheritances. Names appeared repeatedly: Richard, Henry, Margaret. The initials on the crate suddenly made sense. R.H. Perhaps Richard Henry, the patriarch of a family that had once held wealth but lost it through conflict. Jake's head spun. Coins, paintings, books, letters. This wasn't junk. This was a family's legacy, sealed away and forgotten. He sat back hard, chest heaving, eyes locked on the hoard spread before him. From outside, footsteps approached again. Carl, the custodian, appeared in the doorway, squinting into the dust, his pale face creased into curiosity. "Find something?" he asked in his flat voice. Jake instinctively shifted, blocking the view of the crate with his body. "Just old junk," he muttered quickly, his voice cracked with false casualness. Carl studied him for a moment, then shrugged, uninterested, and shuffled away. Jake exhaled in relief, clutching the pouch of coins tighter. Buddy pressed against his side, eyes shining. Jake stroked his fur absently, whispering, "We did it, boy. We really did it." But the triumph was tangled with dread. What he held was more than treasure. It was history, weighty with responsibility. Still, he couldn't deny the thrill coursing through him. For years he had scraped by, invisible, forgotten. And now, here he was, sitting in a storage unit with silver spilling through his fingers and a dog grinning beside him like they had stumbled into a secret world. Jake gathered the coins, paintings, and letters back into the crate, then replaced the lid as best he could. His hands shook as he lifted the crate, heavier than he expected. He hauled it toward his truck, muscles straining, sweat dripping into his eyes. Buddy trotted alongside, tail high, ears swiveling as though guarding their prize. He slid the crate into the bed of the truck, covering it with an old tarp. He glanced around the lot, heart racing, half expecting someone to confront him, to demand what he had found. But the crowd was still gathered at the far end, bidding on another unit, voices rising in competition. No one noticed him. Jake leaned against the truck, wiping his brow, chest heaving. He thought of Sarah and Daniel. He pictured Daniel's face if he could one day hand him books for college, a future free from struggle. He imagined Sarah's expression softening, just once, when she realized he had finally done something right. Buddy nudged his hand, breaking the reverie. Jake smiled faintly, scratching behind his ears. "Yeah, buddy. Let's get out of here before anyone changes their mind." As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the rumble steadied his nerves. He glanced back at the tarp-covered crate and felt the weight of choice settle heavy on him. Treasure or burden? Gift or curse? He didn't know yet, but for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel like a dead end. Buddy curled in the passenger seat, eyes bright, as if he already knew their lives had changed forever. The crate sat in Jake Wilson's garage, hidden beneath an old tarp and stacks of tools that hadn't been touched in years. The musty smell of wood and metal filled the air, clinging to his clothes, seeping into every corner of his thoughts. Buddy lay near the crate most nights, his massive frame curled protectively around it, ears flicking at every sound, as if guarding not just treasure, but a secret that could fracture or remake their lives. Jake tossed on his sagging mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling while the night hummed with silence. Sleep was no friend to him anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw coins spilling like water through his fingers, paintings glowing with forgotten brilliance, letters whispering the names of ghosts who had been dead for decades. More often, he saw Daniel, his son, staring at him with quiet disappointment, eyes that asked the question Jake could never answer. "Why weren't you there for me, Dad?" Every morning, he dragged himself to the shop with bags under his eyes, shoulders heavier than before. Tom Hargrove, the veteran worker with the graying mustache, clapped him on the back one afternoon and said, "You look like hell, Wilson. You fighting phantoms again?" Jake forced a laugh but said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to confess that the phantoms this time weren't from the battlefield, but from his own greed and guilt. On a Thursday evening, Sarah called. Her voice was brisk, controlled, as always. "Daniel's school fees went up again," she said, no preamble. "I can handle it, but it's tight." "He's growing, Jake. He needs more than I can give." Jake sat in the darkened kitchen, staring at the envelope of coins he had pulled from the crate, the silver glinting faintly in the lamplight. "I want to help," he said quietly. Sarah paused. "You've said that before. This time, I mean it." His voice cracked with the weight of truth. She sighed, the sound weary. "Then prove it. Don't make promises you can't keep. Daniel's old enough to see through them now." When the call ended, Jake sat frozen, Buddy pressing his head against his leg. The guilt was suffocating. He could change their lives overnight with what lay in that crate. Pay off debts, repair the apartment, send Daniel to college. But each time he touched the artifacts, those letters tied with twine, those books inked with someone else's story, his conscience screamed. These things weren't his. They had belonged to a family, a lineage cut short. To keep them all felt like theft. The nights blurred together. Jake found himself pacing the garage, coins clinking softly as he sifted them between his fingers, trying to imagine a balance. He began to form a plan, the only one that seemed bearable. He would keep a portion, enough to breathe, enough to stand tall again. He would send another portion quietly to Sarah and Daniel, perhaps through a trust or anonymous envelope, something that would ease their struggles without fanfare. And the rest, those paintings, the bulk of the silver, the letters, he would find a way to return. A museum, perhaps. Or maybe he could track down the descendants of Richard Henry, the initials carved into the wood. The thought did not ease him entirely, but it dulled the sharpest edge of guilt. At the diner, Marlene noticed his distraction. She plunked down a plate of pie and leaned close, her blonde curls frizzing wildly under the fluorescent lights. "You're carrying something heavy, Jake," she said. "I can see it in your shoulders. Whatever it is, just remember, what you do with it defines you more than having it in the first place." Jake offered a strained smile. "You always know what to say." "That's because I've lived long enough to see men drown in things they thought would save them," she replied, patting his arm before walking away. Her words haunted him that night. In his dreams, he saw Daniel again. But this time the boy's face brightened as he opened an envelope thick with bills, his future no longer shadowed by poverty. Jake woke with tears on his cheeks, Buddy's warm body pressed against his side. The next morning, Jake rose with a grim sort of clarity. He dragged the crate into the center of the garage, laid everything out on an old blanket, the coins, the books, the paintings, the letters. He stared at them until the morning light crept across the floor, and then he began dividing them into piles. A small stack of coins and one painting he would keep. A larger portion, wrapped carefully, he would set aside for Sarah and Daniel, and the rest, still vast and awe-inspiring, he would someday deliver to rightful hands. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a balance he could live with. Buddy sat beside him, ears alert, watching as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Jake scratched behind his ears and whispered, "We'll do right, boy. Not just for us, for them too." Buddy thumped his tail once, solemn, almost approving. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt the faint stirrings of peace. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a path forward, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and the crate in Jake Wilson's garage no longer haunted him as it once had. After long nights of deliberation, he had finally begun to act. He contacted a local museum, the Harrington Historical Society, a modest but respected institution in the city. Its curator, Dr. Evelyn Harper, was a woman in her late 50s, tall and angular, with silver hair always pulled into a severe bun. Her steel blue eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting the integrity of history. Evelyn's voice was steady, almost stern, but her heart beat fiercely for preserving the past. When Jake first walked into her office, carrying one of the fragile letters and a coin as proof, he felt like an imposter. His rough work boots tracked mud onto the polished floor, and his calloused hands seemed unworthy of handling such delicate treasures. Buddy sat obediently at his side, his amber eyes roaming the high shelves lined with books and artifacts. Dr. Harper studied the items with care, her long fingers tracing the faded ink, her lips pursed. "Mr. Wilson," she said finally, looking up at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Do you realize what you've brought me?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "All I know is, it doesn't belong to me." For the first time, a small smile softened her stern expression. "That honesty is rare. These documents reference the Henry family, a prominent lineage nearly lost to time. If what you say is true, you've preserved a piece of history we thought was gone." Through the museum's network, Evelyn tracked down distant descendants of Richard Henry. After weeks of searching, she located Thomas Caldwell, a man in his early 60s living 2 states away. Thomas arrived a month later, his tall frame stooped with age, but his presence dignified. He had a full head of silver hair, neatly combed, and wore a wool coat despite the spring warmth. His voice was calm, tinged with sadness, for he carried the weight of a family name that had dwindled into obscurity. When he saw the letters and paintings, Thomas's eyes welled. "These were my grandfather's stories," he whispered, brushing trembling fingers over the cracked leather of a book. "I thought they were lost forever." He turned to Jake, his expression fierce with gratitude. "You could have sold this, hidden it, stolen history for yourself, but you didn't." Jake lowered his gaze, embarrassed by the praise. "I just wanted to do right for them, for my boy." Thomas insisted Jake keep a portion of the treasure as thanks. He pressed a thick envelope into Jake's hand, heavier than Jake had expected. "Your honesty gave me back my family's voice. Let this help you rebuild yours." With that gift, Jake paid off his debts quietly, without fanfare. He fixed the sagging roof of his apartment, replaced the broken couch with something sturdy, even bought a second-hand desk where Daniel might someday sit and do all homework if he visited. Most importantly, Jake sent a large sum to Sarah with a simple note, for Daniel's future, from his father. When Sarah read it, her chest tightened. Though she had been hardened by years of disappointment, she could not deny the sincerity of the gesture. She called Jake, her voice softer than he had heard in years. "Thank you, Jake." "He'll never forget this, Daniel, too," began to warm. His text messages grew longer, less formal. He even asked about Buddy, remembering the puppy who had once stolen his baseball cap and refused to give it back. Jake clutched those words like gold, more valuable than any coin. At the shop, word of Jake's honesty spread. Eddie Harper, the wiry braggart, shook his head in disbelief. "Man, if I'd found that, I'd have cashed out fast." But even he muttered with a trace of respect, "Guess that's why it found you and not me." Tom Hargrove clapped Jake on the back, his mustache twitching with a smile. "You did good, Wilson." "Better than most men would have." It was Marlene from the diner who organized the gathering. "You can't just walk around like nothing happened," she declared, wagging a finger. "People ought to know when one of their own proves the world ain't all bad." So, on a bright Saturday afternoon, the workers from the shop, neighbors from the block, and a handful of museum staff gathered in the lot behind the diner. They grilled burgers, children played tag, and Buddy raced circles around them, barking joyfully, his tail a blur. Jake stood awkwardly at the edge, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, until Tom nudged him forward. The crowd clapped, Marlene grinned, and Dr. Harper raised her voice to say, "This man preserved history not because he had to, but because it was right. That kind of integrity is worth more than gold." Jake felt his face flush. He wasn't used to applause. But when he looked down at Buddy, tongue lolling, eyes bright, he let himself smile. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man who had failed his family, or the soldier haunted by ghosts. He felt like someone who belonged. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake tilted his head back, breathing in the laughter around him. He imagined Daniel here someday, meeting these people, seeing his father not as a broken man, but as someone who had fought to make things right. Buddy leapt at his side, tail wagging furiously. Jake reached down, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "We made it, boy. We're home." In the end, Jake's journey was never just about coins, paintings, or forgotten letters hidden in a rusted box. It was about a man standing at the edge of despair who found the courage to choose honesty over greed, love over silence, and community over isolation. With Buddy at his side, he discovered that true treasure is not measured in silver or gold, but in the chance to mend broken bonds, to give back what was lost, and to be welcomed once more as part of something greater than himself. This story reminds us all that miracles don't always come with thunder or fire. They come quietly, through the wag of a loyal dog's tail, the kindness of neighbors, or the choice to do what is right even when it costs us. Perhaps that is God's way of working in our lives, through small moments of faith, courage, and redemption that ripple outward and transform entire communities. If Jake's story touched your heart, take a moment today to thank God for the hidden blessings in your own life. Share this video with someone who needs hope. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so we can keep telling stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and endless love.